Why do we fear death? What a morbid subject, right? I think with this pandemic that the world seems to be facing, that is the motivation for our emotions, for our lockdowns, for our concern, is the reality of death. We're not too worried about the symptoms of this coronavirus, because the symptoms are similar to the symptoms of the flu. So it's not the symptoms that we're so much worried about. We're worrying about the inevitable end. That's why we take so much joy when we see folks that are well who once had this virus, because it gives us hope that we don't have to die or we're going to have to face death. Okay. And if we turn to the book of 1 Chronicles, the 29th chapter, we'll look at David. David, guy in the Bible we learn about from the time he was a boy, growing up, watching his daddy's sheep, protecting his daddy's sheep from the lion and from the wolf and all. And he grows up and he fights Goliath, the Philistine champion, and beats him. And he goes on to become a great warrior and then a king. Like many of us, makes mistakes, fails a lot. But in the end, 1 Chronicles, the 29th chapter, starting in the 26th verse, "Thus David, the son of Jesse, reigned over all Israel. And the time that he reigned over Israel was 40 years. 7 years reigned he in Hebron, and 33 years reigned he in Jerusalem. And he died in a good old age, full of riches and honor, and Solomon his son reigned in his stead." And he died in a good old age, full of days, riches and honor, and Solomon his son reigned in his stead. And so we're going to talk about death today. We're going to talk about death because we fear death. We're afraid to die. Why do we fear death? Because it's unknown, right? But there are so many other things that are unknown. There are species of animals that we haven't seen that are unknown. There's so many things that we don't know. So why do we fear death? I'm thinking it's because of our teaching, how we're raised. There is a fear of the unknown. But I mean, everything that we believe, everything that we embrace, as you know, even from when you're dealing with your children, from the time they're young and growing up, you can convince a child of anything. You can convince a child that there's a Santa Claus. You can convince a child there's an Easter Bunny. You can convince a child there's Jesus. You can convince a child there's Muhammad. You can convince a child of anything. You can convince a child that a certain group of people are inferior. You can convince a child that they are superior. You can convince a child that they are smart. You can convince a child that they are dumb. You can convince a child that they are handsome or pretty. You can convince a child that they're ugly. Children are like that, like sponges, and however we choose to bring them up. You know, oftentimes the difference between a successful individual and an individual who's not successful at all has a lot to do with their upbringing. There's always that age-old argument of nature versus nurture. Is it the nature of an individual to be a certain way, or is it because of the environment they were raised in? And what I'm suggesting is, in most cases, unless there is an abnormality, a mental abnormality, it is the environment the individual is raised in. And that's why some of us as parents, try to make sure our children are in certain schools, our children are exposed to this, exposed to that, things that we weren't exposed to simply because we want them to be better. And we think, oh no, it's nature this, nature that. I don't think so. Even in a natural sense, the foods that we eat. I mean, my parents, they loved me. Raised on military bases. I remember every Saturday my mother would come home from the commissary and she'd have potato chips and ice cream and big old cinnamon rolls with raisins in them. So those things that I loved so much. And for snacks, I would make my own milkshakes and with a big old bowl of potato chips on the side. Because she loved us and she was giving us the things that she knew made us happy. But back then, in those days, in the late 60s and 70s and all that, they didn't have the insight into what kind of foods are actually killing us, the insights that we have today. And so she did her best. My mother came up in the Depression. My mother's, her dad was Mexican. She said they grew up eating beans and tortillas all the time. And she was just, in my mind, that she was simply making sure that we had benefits, that we had a satisfaction that she grew up never having. She did her best out of her love. But we find now, they were killing us, right? And so she tried to do her best. And so now I try to do my best with the healthy foods and the school and even being home for homework. In my day, you did your own homework. You didn't have parental help. You had encyclopedias. That was it. But now, and there was really no encouragement. The only encouragement to do your homework and to do what you needed to do was on report card day. If your grades weren't good, how come your grades are bad? Because you didn't do your homework all the time or as well as you could or as in a timely manner. But there's so much parental involvement today because we know that the success of our children has a lot to do or will have a lot to do with how much we involve ourselves in their everyday life and activities. Because after all, they're kids. They don't know. But if you ask a kid, what time should you go to bed? They'll say never. When I fall asleep. Or what kind of foods shall you eat? If you just gave your kid their opportunity to eat whatever they wanted, what would they eat? Whatever they wanted. Probably wouldn't be too healthy. And so there are roles of a parent in order to instill healthy attitudes, healthy behaviors, so that when they grow old, the environment that we brought them up in will not come back to haunt them with diabetes, with high blood pressure, with cholesterol issues, and heart ailments, and all. And what I'm suggesting today is the one area that it seems that we've left out, and it's obvious, is the reality, the inevitability of death, and what it actually is. And maybe we don't know. Maybe we don't know. But this is what we need to be considering, because every human being, since the beginning of time, no matter what race, no matter what nationality, no matter what gender, the one thing that we all have in common is that we will eventually die. We have it or we will. Those that have not been born yet, what they have in common is that we will die. And so when we're facing situations like this pandemic, the reason it's so disconcerting is because we're afraid to face what we must ultimately all face. And what I'm suggesting is that maybe we might take time to deal with this now. Begin to consider. I'm always suggesting and recommending that we take time to meditate. I meditated all my life. Early on as a young martial artist, 15, 16 years old. And then throughout life, even as I've grown older. And 25 years as a mailman, walking the streets for 4 and 5 and 6 hours a day, there was like walking meditation. I've always meditated. And so you consider a thing. And so what I would suggest, I strongly suggest the meditation to be considering death, the inevitability of death, and the fear of death, and should there be a fear of death. And I believe as we begin meditating upon the subject, we'll come to a peace in recognizing that this is a place that I must go. I know that is hard, especially the younger you are, to really focus on things like that. I know myself, I haven't bought a funeral or a cemetery plot, maybe for that same reason. We're talking right now, and I'm sharing with you, me as well. I think for me sometimes, it's when I think, I'm not afraid to die. I'm not afraid of what comes next. I don't know if it's fear, but what I dread is not being around to see the technological advancements and the changes and the things that the population will begin to experience. I think as a way to resolve this issue, we have certain folks that have produced movies that reflect dire and extreme apocalypse, all over the world, the Mad Max and all that kind of stuff, or the Book of Eli and those type movies. Because who wants to live through all that, But on the other hand, the reality is that this time that we're living is no different than any other time in history. Folks faced situations. Folks had to face their mortality. And folks finally had to give in to the inevitable. And how you leave this thing. I remember my mother when she passed away. Now, my mother was like a believer for all the years that I can remember. And when she was like 97 or 96 years old, as she was passing away, she was ready to go. And I think sometimes that helps. Being a religious person and believing and that you're going to this particular place. But I think for some of us, the reality sets in that there are probably, who came up with this thing about streets of gold and pearly white gates. Everybody's issued a set of wings and all. I think we've begun to logically look at what the religion has bought into and begin to realize that some of those things can't possibly be true. And so then what has happened is that was what was embraced to be satisfied with the reality of passing on, as that you're going to this place where there's a mansion waiting for you. And what I want to suggest is that I don't want to say an ignorant time, but a time when people just didn't know what we know, didn't see what we see, couldn't understand that a place called hell couldn't possibly be under the ground because we understand what the earth consists of. And understand that a place called heaven isn't up there because depending on what place you are on this planet, up there isn't always up there. We know too much. And so as we begin to release some of those age-old beliefs on like where heaven is or where hell is and if it even exists simply because of the times that folks were living and the scare tactics required by politicians or religious leadership or both, we've begun to realize that some of those things can't possibly be true. So what we've given up, as we've given up those expressions of what the future would be after we leave this place, as we've given up some of those ideas that are ridiculous, we have also then lost that which has given us a peace and a comfort in our inevitable passing. Okay? And so this is where we have to focus. And so like most folks, myself as well, we ignore the inevitable if it seems not desirable all the way up to the point where it has to be faced. And if we've ignored the inevitable for our entire lives, all the way up to the place where it has to be faced, when you are facing that, it's unknown, and we are full of fear. It's like preparing for a fight, an inevitable fight. It's like working out, keeping yourself fit because you know you have a big fight coming up. Or not. Your best bet is to train for that fight so that when the time comes, you'll be ready. But if you're just ignoring it, disregarding it, keeping it out of your mind, not wanting to think about it, so you're not preparing, you're not exercising, you're not practicing, you're not working out, when that time comes, and that time will come, you'll not be prepared. And now you're facing an opponent that is prepared, and you are not. Death is prepared. That's the opponent, okay? And how you're going to deal with that opponent is your mindset. Are you going to be well or are you not going to be well? So it would behoove us not to simply ignore the inevitable. Because then we're not teaching our children. We're not teaching our children. And so they don't understand. The reality is everybody dies. Mama dies, grandma died, granddad died, dad died. Everybody dies. We need to be healthy about it. And really considering and meditating on death. The fear of death, or what could possibly be next. Now for me, I don't know there's going to be a heaven. I don't know or hardly believe that there's a hell. But I do believe that as an entity, that this body is not me, okay? And because if you cut off this hand or if you cut off this foot, I'm still here in my entirety. So who I am is not this, okay? This is just the body, okay? When I was growing up as a teenager, my car had a 62 Comet. When I was inside that car was not me. I was inside. And here as well. So I believe then that I don't age, my body ages. I don't get decrepit, my body might get decrepit. I can't be crippled, my body might be crippled. And so when this body finally lays down, when the body goes to sleep, I am not asleep. You get brain waves and all that stuff. There's stuff always going on because you're inside. So when this body lays down, I continue, okay? The body finally dies. And so maybe that's part of the fear that we have of death, is that we die. Well, what I want to suggest to you is you are not going to die. Your body might lay down and your body may die, but you continue. Now see, I don't know about the whole hell thing, because it seems to me, even as from an historical perspective, going back to Europe, hell was an extreme scare tactic used to keep the masses in line. Don't challenge the church. Don't challenge the government, you know. Sort of, they've been trying that, we've been facing a little bit here, in this nation and all over the world. Consider that. And as you read these Bible stories, don't just look at them as from an historical perspective, because some of them are ridiculous and couldn't possibly have happened. I'm in a precarious position to be trying to explain that to my daughter, even recently as we're going through some of these stories, is that, Dad, come on, If just recently she asked me the age-old question, the question that I asked when I was her age, if there were no other people, when Cain left, where did he get his wife from, Personally, I was glad she asked that question, because I had so many questions when I was her age and I had gotten no answers. And finally I left home, I became an atheist, because I knew it couldn't possibly be true. There were too many holes in the religious stories. But begin to look at those stories. Some of them, as maybe actually happened from an historical perspective, especially when you look at Chronicles and some of those historical books, But then begin to look at some of the stories, as analogies, where they could have happened, but whether they happen or not, what do we get from that story? And one story in particular that we're going to talk about for a moment is a story in the book of Daniel, found in the book of Daniel, the 3rd chapter, about 3 Hebrew boys. We know the story, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Well, there were 3 Hebrews. The Hebrews had been taken into captivity by the Babylonians, King Nebuchadnezzar and his group. And so they were in the land of Babylon. And what is very important to understand is that Nebuchadnezzar only took the best. They were the best. And they were held in high esteem. They were educated, they were smart. And Nebuchadnezzar was fond of these Hebrews. And the people of Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, the people in his high court, they were jealous of these Hebrews. And they knew the Hebrews would have their God, and they would pray, a certain amount of times a day, and nothing will take them from how they respond to God. They had no other gods but their God. They were jealous of the relationship, of the attitude that this King Nebuchadnezzar had to these Hebrews, and these 3 in particular, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which are actually their Babylonian names. And so the high court of the Babylonians devised a plan to jam up these Hebrews. So they decided, they went to the king and said, King, we're going to create a big golden statue of you, O king. And we're going to mandate, after it's created, that at a certain time in the day, all of our musicians will get on their instruments and play. And at the time the music goes forth, that everyone in the entire kingdom will bow down and worship this golden image of you. And they were stroking that king's ego, man. He was really enjoying that. Yeah, that's a good idea, And he said, King, and because you're so great, that if anybody who doesn't bow down, that they should be killed. They should be executed, because you are God. You are like God. You are king. And besides you, there is no other. And the king is like, doing really good right now. He said, that's a good idea. He had no idea that his high court was conspiring against the Hebrews, because they knew the Hebrews would never bow to any image. They would only bow to God. The king wasn't thinking about that. He was just thinking about, man, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Make that golden statue of me, play that music, and everybody bow down. Anybody that doesn't bow down has to be executed. Great idea. Because the king probably knew everybody was going to bow down. So they made that image. They made that statue, that golden statue of King Nebuchadnezzar in the desert, in the plain of Dura, the Bible says. And at a particular time and day, the people were all set up, all standing up. They were all ready. They knew what they had to do. They knew that when the music played, everybody would bow, and the people were willing and ready. We see how folks are in our society about certain political leaders and rulers. How, they're ready. Sure. Music played, everybody bowed. But guess who didn't bow? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They couldn't. And so just imagine that, Just imagine an entire city, an entire land where you have maybe thousands of people, and the trumpets blow, the musical instruments play, everybody drops down. There are these three guys still standing up. And bound down, looking around. There's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now the high court, they knew this was going to happen. The king didn't. He was just ready to be exalted by his people. But no, these three boys weren't standing up. And the men looked and said, look, there's three. Who are they? They knew who they were. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're not bound down. And then the king was angry. The king wasn't putting it together. All he saw was himself as being disrespected, okay? But he saw it with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and he said, you know what? We're gonna give you guys. He had them summoned. And he spoke with them, like, what are you guys doing? You see all my people, all the people are bound. Now you guys are here. You've been in my court. You've been in my land. I know you're prisoners, but we've treated you well. We put you on the high courts. You wear the finest clothes. You eat the best foods. You're treated well. Why are you disrespecting me like this? Now I'm gonna play this music one more time. We're gonna have one more take. And when everybody has to bow, and you guys need to bow. And there is an execution plan for anybody who doesn't bow. That is an edict. It has to be done. It is by the king's word, which could not be rescinded. And so they had this furnace, which was their form of execution, I guess. And it was a hot furnace made of stone with like a hole on the top where you could look down into it. It was a furnace. And so, if you don't bow down, you're going to be thrown in that furnace. All three of you. No kidding, no joke. Bow down when that music plays. And the Hebrew spoke up and said, look, it doesn't matter how hot you heat this furnace. It doesn't matter how many times you play the music. We will not bow. And if you throw us in that furnace, our God will deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we still will not bow. Now where could you have a boldness like that? Our God will deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we still will not bow. And so they didn't play the music. They didn't bow. The king was angry, had them thrown in the furnace. Had the furnace heated up 7 times hotter than it was, the scripture tells us. So hot that when the furnace was opened to throw them in, the heat blast was so much it killed the men that were opening the furnace. Okay, they threw them in. Now, according to the story, as we go on in the story, as they were in there, and finally the king went to a place where he could see inside the furnace itself, and he's looking in it, and he's saying, man, he said, how many did we throw in there? And they said, well, 3. The king said, well, I see these guys in there walking around, and there's 4. And one resembles a son of the gods. He didn't say the son of God, how it's quoted so often in Sunday school. He said a son of the gods. And he let them out. Then he threw the people, the high court folks that set this whole thing up, he threw them in there. Interesting. Okay, what I want to share with you is 2 things. One thing is the idea, the understanding we get from these 3 Hebrews, that they trusted God to deliver them. Okay, but even if he didn't, they still would not bow. So they recognized their mortality. They recognized that God is God. God can deliver. But even if he doesn't, we're going to die. We're going to die anyway, so we're still not going to bow. And so then even as we correlate that story then to, say, modern times, our lives today, what is the bowing? Bowing is the system that is set up. Whatever the system is, whatever nation you live in, whatever neighborhood, whatever family, a system that is not godly, that is not good, that is not righteous, that has obvious negatives attached to it, they wouldn't participate. Okay? And so that's what we get from this story. So the reality is, we don't know if this actually happened or not. It could have. But what do we get from it? What we get from it is the story. The moral of the story is, don't succumb to the system that you may be in the midst of simply because everybody else is doing it. Do what's right. And because you are doing what's right, you will be delivered from the evil. But even if you're not, you'll come out on the other side. Whether the other side is here or there. Everybody dies. Just consider that. Meditate on it. That's my homework. I'm giving you some homework today. Meditate. Meditate on that truth. Why do you fear death? Should you fear death? And what would be a healthy way to consider it? Think of those questions and then begin to meditate. You'll be amazed. I think you'll find a freedom. You'll have an opportunity to share that freedom with your children. How's that?